Now, I mentioned earlier that, and I talked about this earlier in the week, that the Greens have announced a plan that may make coal and gas companies liable for climate-fuelled flood damage as part of their Liability for Climate Change Damage Bill 2021, which they introduced last parliamentary sitting period. Now, this bill would allow flood victims to sue fossil fuel companies. Now, I don't know how this can possibly be legal and how it can work. Alex Martin is a commercial lawyer and director of Taurus Legal Management and joins us now. Alex, good morning.
Good morning, Stephen. It's great to be back on my favourite radio station.
Is this just one of these pie-in-the-sky things that the Greens like to say, or is there actually some legal way that you could do? I mean, how does somebody who loses their house through a flood decide, I guess, which mining company they're going to sue to start with?
Yes, well, I suppose the first thing I'd say is it's got to get through Parliament, and they did try last year and it didn't pass. But if it did pass through Parliament, then it would be law. So the Greens can do it if they can pass it through Parliament, and then judges would be forced to try to make a decision, try to push that law through. So the judges, it'd be up to the judges basically to interpret the legislation that's been drafted.
But I mean, that's the point though with a lot of legislation is it's all well and good to, and let's face it, if the Greens do get the balance of power, they could force this kind of lunatic bill through the Parliament.
Sure.
But then if you say it becomes judges' discretion, I mean, in your view, how many of these kind of litigations would actually make it to court?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. So, the legislation says that a person who's suffered climate change damage has the right to recover damages from a major greenhouse emitter. So that would mean that anyone who say, was a victim of flood damage in New South Wales would potentially be able to sue, tens or possibly even hundreds of greenhouse emitters in Australia. I think they, if this legislation did come through, I think they would do that, and I think at least some of them might be successful because the legislation is so broad.
Yeah, okay. Because I mean, I can imagine the first test would be proving that whatever the actual event was caused by climate change, which I would imagine would be pretty impossible to do.
Yeah, that's right. So the courts are very reluctant to get heavily involved in causation issues and in scientific debates. Of course they do, because whether if a building falls down, then you need an engineer's report to show whose responsibility it was who made it fall down, if you like. So the courts are used to that. But this becomes an incredibly complex and an incredibly remote area of law. The law likes causation to be quite close, to be, if someone pollutes a river and you drink the water from the river and you get sick, you should be able to show that one thing led to another. Whereas if you're talking about, a coal-fired power station in WA pollutes the air and then there's a flood in New South Wales, and therefore the coal-fired power station is responsible. I mean, that's extremely remote. So I think the courts would really struggle with that, and the litigation would become long and complex. You'd probably end up with class actions, which are funded by litigation funders, and that's a whole different dimension. It'd be a nightmare from a legal point of view.
And I imagine too that the emitters, I mean the coal companies and the mining companies, would probably challenge the validity of this kind of legislation in the High Court as well.
Yes, that's probably right. It could be challenged in the court. I think it could be challenged on constitutional grounds, although I'm not so sure that it'd be successful. But I think what they'd probably say is well, I've complied with the EPA legislation. I've complied with all of the other laws, and I'm entitled to emit legally this amount of emissions. And so then for me to be liable over here is unfair, and I think that's the heart of it. If we want to stop emissions, then we can do it in all sorts of ways, by regulating it, by doing emissions trading, all sorts of ways. It's really a question of what's the most effective way of reducing emissions, and I think this is really putting the cart before the horse, and you're saying, well, someone's got to go to court and sue for damages and then scare the rest of the emitters, which seems to be sort of just out of proportion.
Yeah, as always, when you say things quickly, they sound good, but when you dig down into the detail, not so much. Alex, good to talk to you.
Yeah. Thanks, Stephen. Nice to be on.
Alex Martin, commercial lawyer and director of Taurus Legal Management.